I suppose if you had to think about the sightings of in West Wales in 1977, you'd think about three particular events. The landing of a UFO at the Broadhaven Primary School, a series of sightings at a place called Ripperston Farm, a few miles away up on the cliffs, and a series of sightings which afflicted a hotelier living at the Haven Fort Hotel in between Broadhaven and Little Haven. Let me just touch upon her for a moment. Her name was Rosa Granville, Spanish in origin, and her daughter's name is Francine. And I believe Francine still lives at the Haven Fort, although Rosa's now dead. One night, Rosa woke up to a rocking sound outside her window. There was the window was rattling. There was a light shining into her room, and she was deathly terrified. So terrified that she got out of bed and she went to the window and she looked out. And what did she see there? A landed object on the ground with figures walking around it. I can't tell you whether she saw one or two figures. I believe it was more than one, but they were silver suited. They were very tall, and they seemed to be inspecting the ground. Now, Rosa Granville reported this sighting to the newspapers and became the subject of some a bit of a joke, I suppose, amongst some of the people living in Little Haven, unfairly, I might add, because she was soon to be vindicated, because there was a whole other flurry of sightings soon to follow. But what was really interesting about her sighting was that after the event, and I know I've heard this firsthand from the witnesses when I visited the area about 10 or 11 years ago, they were visited by some men. And the way this story was put to me, I'll just tell to you now. Francine was sitting in the bar. The bar at the Haven Fort Hotel looks out over a sort of wide gravel drive. And she was in the bar, and they heard the doorbell go. And she said to me that was the first thing that was strange, because whenever a car comes up on the driveway, we hear it come up the driveway. But suddenly there was someone at the door. So she said, we went to the door and there were two men standing there. She said to me that they had skin that was like a woman's skin, is the word she used. And she said they were very similar looking. They were dressed very smartly. And their car, behind them, she said, looked like a silver futuristic car. She said, I'd never seen a car like it. But what was even stranger was that these men then said to her, we've come to talk to you about your UFO sighting, but we can't stop today, we'll come another day. And that was it. And then they left. Now that is deeply strange behaviour, and I'm sure we've all met somebody who is deeply strange. No, we've all met people who are deeply strange, right? These people do exist, they do exist. But I'll tell you something that is even stranger. These reports of strange men who come and ask peculiarly placed questions are found all over the world. All over the world. And you only have to look at the similarities between these reports to draw the conclusion that there's something deeply strange going on. And I don't mean that to imply that these men were some sort of alien or from, government agency. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that these things do happen. Because what happened at the Haven Fort Hotel then happened again at Ripperston Farm. Now, Ripperston Farm, as many of you will know, is a very, very remote place. Have you been to Ripperston Farm? I mean, it's right. So it's right out on the cliffs. Really, quite a spooky place, I would imagine, if you were to live there in the winter. And at the time, of course, Billy Coombs was the head herdsman, and Pauline Coombs was his wife, and they had a couple of kids. Well, twins, brother and sister as well. And of course the affair at the Ripperston Farm began On a dark night, Pauline's driving down the road, down a little lane. Suddenly, a globe of light falls from the sky and begins following her car. It becomes even more terrifying when the light spins around and flies directly at the car towards the windscreen. It looks like they're going to hit, and then it goes straight up. By this point, she's absolutely terrified, as you would be. All the kids are terrified. She comes to a halt outside the house. They run inside and grab her husband. He comes to the door just in time to see this globe of light above the car, and it flies away. Now, that sighting, as well as being quite interesting, could be out of a textbook. If you've read any UFO books, it follows a certain pattern. But what's really interesting is that that report I referred to earlier on, Project Condign, the one done by the Defence Intelligence Staff, that focuses on the military applications of this sort of phosphorant phenomena. So they admit that these things are real in this report, and that what she saw and what she was laughed at for seeing doesn't necessarily... Suddenly we have independent confirmation from our government that this sort of phenomena exists, and that it could actually have some sort of military application. Whatever application is, I have no idea. But it's interesting. The second really interesting thing to happen at Ripperston Farm, of course, is that the whole family will witness, or Billy and his wife Pauline at least, will witness to one of these very tall figures which appeared at one of their windows one evening. And of course that was an incident that scared them all to death. But I interviewed Pauline Coombs because I was interested to see how much of what she said then she was still prepared to say. And I have to say that not only was most of what she told me perfectly consistent, but I gleaned further bits of information from her. So for example, she told me that there was a bush next to the window, and she said that it was blackened or damaged after this figure, this glowing silver-suited figure with this blacked-out face, had appeared at the window. She said it was damaged, and she also said that the paint around the window refused to stick properly for a while. And that was interesting, but of course we can't verify that because it happened so long ago. But what was interesting was that the son of the family did report also an encounter with a car, a futuristic looking car, which came to the property after their sighting, and that there were men there, dressed smartly. I don't want to use the word men in black because it carries so many unfortunate connotations now. You know, you can't use that phrase without thinking about Will Smith. But the point is these things were reported, and I'd read about them. But like I'm sure you've all read about men in black and UFO sightings, but when you hear it from the horse's mouth, it has a very different effect, I think. So I was interested in whether or not any of these sightings which were happening around West Wales had attracted any sort of interest from the government. If you go back and look at what the MOD said at the time, they'll tell you, well, it's pretty clear actually, they were aware of the reports that were going on, but they didn't really claim to have any information on it. They claimed they had, you know, they were very woolly about the whole thing. And in fact, Rosa Granville's local MP wrote trying to get answers, and he got a reply basically saying that there was nothing in all this. I think his name was James Wellbeloved, the person who replied. Anyway, you can go and look it up. But the point is, and it's a quite a significant point, is it was in writing at the time that they had nothing on any of these events. Well, I'll come now to the Broadhaven UFO incident at the school in February. I have with me tonight a statement from one of the witnesses, one of the original witnesses, who's happy for me to read this out, and I will read it out. But just before I do, I went to the school about 10 or 11 years ago and looked through. They have a wonderful scrapbook there at Broadhaven Primary School. And the story I was able to piece together is the one I'm sure you've all heard, that on a drizzly afternoon, I think it was a Friday afternoon, the children came running in and alerted their headmaster, Ralph Llewellyn, to the fact that they had seen at the end of their playing field, at a hedge that bordered a stream and looked out to a wider hill behind, that they'd seen what they described as a landed flying saucer, a UFO. It was, in fact, they didn't actually have a full view of it. It was half obscured behind the trees. And actually what was really interesting about looking at their drawings is that this object bears a very striking similarity to the one that was seen in Bishopston, which first ignited my interest. Very, very striking similarity. Of course, the headmaster was deeply, deeply sceptical, but the boys' parents were unprepared to forget the whole thing, and Randall Jones Pugh, who was a local researcher at the time, was very, very quickly made aware and went down to the place where this object seemed to have appeared. And he basically discovered a very, very muddy terrain where it would be very, very difficult to place any sort of machinery. Now, that may or may not be true. I've no doubt that he went there, and I've no doubt it was muddy, because it was raining. The visibility was not good that day, and I've spent a lot of time in Broadhaven when I was researching the Watchers, and I can tell you that there are many people living there, particularly near the sewerage works and the hill opposite, who will say, I'm afraid what they saw was a sewerage tanker, and they've been watching too much Star Trek, because one of the boys actually drew a figure that has pointy ears. Well, I have to say I don't believe that what they saw was a sewerage tanker. I understand why people say it, but if you look at the spot and if you go there, as I have, it's a very, the hill is pretty steep, but also the sewerage works aren't really completely visible. It seems like a very odd thing to have seen. But what convinces me more than that is that the boys all stand by their story today. Well, at least those of them that I have been able to speak to do. And as far back as 1996, I think they all stuck by their story as well. Well, the interesting thing is, in these sorts of events, obviously we can't go back, we can't check, but what we can do is look at the evidence from the time, which is obviously the most reliable. And the evidence from the time was gathered by Ralph Llewellyn. And I know people who, he's no longer with us, I'm afraid, but I do know people who knew him, who said to me he regretted until the day he died not going out to look when the boys called him. And the reason he regretted it is because he asked them all to draw what they saw. And of course all those drawings tallied. They all drew pretty much the same thing. A few discrepancies, but it's a dome-shaped object, a cigar-shaped object with a dome on top, and maybe a light, maybe not. What's also interesting is that many people living around the school, there's a small road that overlooks it. I did actually speak to a couple of people who implied to me that adults had seen the object as well. Now actually at the time there were some canteen workers who were prepared to say they had seen an object up there that looked very similar to what the boys had reported on a different day, and they also thought this thing was pretty unusual. Now, if this incident had occurred in complete isolation, let's suppose that it had, you might be forgiven. I suppose you might be forgiven for thinking what happened was somebody somewhere was dumping some sewerage. They weren't meant to be doing it. It was maybe illegal. They were quite happy for somebody to go away and invent a UFO story. There's lots of big ifs in there. But it didn't happen in isolation, because people all over Pembrokeshire that summer reported seeing silver objects on the ground. And what's also interesting, or perhaps telling about this, is that these objects were never seen moving. They were seen disappearing in situ. reappearing somewhere else in another part of the field, which doesn't really sound like a sewerage tanker to me. One of the witnesses was a woman who was university educated and lived very near to Ripperston Farm, and her name was Josephine Hewison. Well, Josephine woke up one morning to look out of her window to see an object that she described was like an upturned jelly mould, and again with a brushed aluminium finish. And she said this object was so big that it completely blocked out a local greenhouse, a greenhouse standing on her property. Well, Josephine stood by. I interviewed Josephine myself when I was researching this book, and she doesn't live in Wales anymore. Stood by it, stood by the story. But when I was most recently doing research for this book, I went back to the Havens and I met a chap who knew her, and he said to me, I'm extremely sceptical about all of this. He said, but bloody hell, she was adamant. She was no changing her mind that she'd seen this, and I can conceive of no reasonable explanation as to why she'd make it up. Why would she make it up? Her neighbours, Pauline and Billy, had been ridiculed because they'd appeared in the press quite a few times. So one of the reasons they were ridiculed is because one of the things they saw was really quite astounding. And this is the story which strains the credulity, I think, of the whole Welsh triangle enigma. I'm sure many of you know what I'm about to say. It's of course the sighting by Pauline Coombs of an object flying into stacked rocks, which was it's a rocky outcrop off the shore of St Bride's Bay. What she thought she saw was an object flying into it, a door opening and closing, and a door within the rocks. Now, if you've ever seen a bird on a bright sunny day flying around the rocks, it can look a bit like a silver disc from a distance. But what's interesting is that somebody else also saw this, which was, maybe they saw it. Somebody else also saw this, and if somebody else was the hotelier at the Haven Port Hotel. Now, that for me also sounds like a bit of a coincidence, but we have to take the testimony at face value. I'll tell you that something. When I was in the Havens, walking around the area around Ripperston Farm and Stacked Rocks, I met a farmer who said to me, I got talking to him about this, and he told me two interesting things. The first was, if you don't think there's anything out in Stacked Rocks, go and talk to the divers at the diving club. That was the first interesting thing. The second thing was that he used to have some people who would stay at his farm because he used to run a bed and breakfast, and he said they would go out walking around Stacked Rocks frequently until one day they came home and they said, "We're never coming back here again." And he said they never spoke about it. Well, I went to the Divers Club and I asked, because my curiosity was piqued. It was a good story, as I said. Stories are what I'm all about, really. And I went and spoke to somebody at the Divers Club, and they said that there were members of their club who had seen equipment under the water around Stacked Rocks. So they said they'd seen a ladder embedded in the rocks. Now that seems to me like something you could go and check, and I'm not a diver. I'm just telling you what they told me. But it did make me think, because at the hotel I learned a story which I don't think has been put down in print before, but I used a version of it fictionalised in my novel, and the story basically came from the hotel where the UFO was seen. And the story boiled down to this: there were some people staying there who worked up at RAF Brawdy. Well, they didn't work at RAF Brawdy, they worked at the top secret naval installation next door. It was officially an oceanographic research station. Very, very top secret at the height of the Cold War. And what they were doing, or what they said they were doing at the time at this station, was running